Uh, so this session is going to be in English, and I want to thank you all for being here today. I hope you had a great kickstart of our seventh Brazilian Studies meeting, which for the first time is supported by the business section of the International Studies Association. So it's truly an honor to be here today. And this is certainly the most international event we had so far. And this is going to be the first round table. We're going to have three, one each day. And we decided to start this one today with a discussion a little bit more about, epistemologies of peace, which makes sense since we are in the global south. There's been a lot of discussion in Brazil and in Latin America in general, but also in other parts of the world about the need to prioritize peace, the concepts, the ways we do theory, the ways we think about peace and conflict in general. So what we did today is really we gather three very experienced scholars, and each one of them will give their own views about how they have been studying peace, how they have been working with, the idea of peace. You'll see that each one of them, and I'll introduce them briefly in a moment, they come from very different backgrounds, they work with different themes, and they also come from different places. They have a very different background, and I think in a way, they represent a little bit of the variety that we can see in peace and conflict studies overall. So before presenting each one of them, I also just want to thank all of those who have been engaged in the organization of this event, PUC-Rio, UFRJ, and everyone from the very large committee that have been working to make this event possible. Also, the business section for helping us make this event even wider and helping us bring some international participants as well. I also want to say that personally, for me, it's such an honor to be in this panel today. Professor Guzzini was in the first ever Brazilian Peace Studies conference that we had back in São Paulo in 2016, and Marcos Allan as well. And I bet you can see how different it is. We started with really a bunch of few very excited young scholars 9 years ago, and now it's really an honor to see the amount of people participating in our event and how it has really been recognized as a main event here in Brazil. And this year I also had the honor to have a dear friend of mine, Sarah and Jerry, here. We did our PhD in Bradford Peace Studies. So it's really a special panel for me, and I hope you will enjoy it. So what we're gonna do, I'm gonna give around 20 minutes for each of the speakers to talk a little bit about their own views of peace, epistemologies of peace, how they've been working with it, and the idea is that really each of you feel free to problematize and put out whatever you want. It's going to be kind of a very free and open conversation. And once they give their talk, and then we're going to have plenty of time for debate and Q&A. So let me start. I'll start in this order with Professor Guzzini. So Professor Stefano Guzzini holds the chair in political and social theory and the Swiss co-chair in federalism, democracy, and international governance. He's on long-term leave from Uppsala University and the Danish Institute for International Studies. He previously held positions at the Central European University and here, so he's at home, and was a guest professor at the University of Bremen, Ljubljana, Lublin, and the Universidade Autónoma de Madrid. He was also fellow at the Hans Institute for Advanced Studies, the Collegio Carlo Alberto, Turin, and the Judith Bradley Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, Department of Government, Cornell University. So you've been everywhere, which is really good. You've been a very complex perspective on peace. He also served as the editor of the Journal of International Relations and Development and co-editor of International Theory, as well as president of the Central and Eastern European Studies International Studies Association. And he's currently associate editor of Foundation Internacional, which is, for those of you who are not aware, one of the key journals here in Brazil on international relations, and also co-editor of the Bristol Studies and International Theory. So, Professor Guzzini, thank you very much for being with us today. Please, you have the word.
Works, right? Welcome all. I hope I will not disappoint people because I will be talking very old-fashioned pre-research. This is partly because I'm old, but it's also partly because we have forgotten a lot of it, and some of it might be needed to return. I'm not saying that this is the only way of doing peace research, not the only way of thinking of this, but I think it's one that is necessary, in particular in these days. Because these days are, at least in the north, closer.
Finger.
All right. I'm not Andrea Bocelli, though. All right. So classical peace research. Why do I think there's a return to some classical peace research necessary? Again, I repeat because it might have not been clear. It's not because I believe it's the only way of doing peace research and the only way of thinking. But it's one that I believe these days is more necessary than maybe we have thought earlier. Why is this the case? Because we are living in an environment in which some people call it great power politics. We could also just call it bullying. Has become the norm of how to think about international relations or how big countries have to relate to each other. In a kind of, well, how can I say, kind of a racket system in which you are basically just trying to bribe, force people around. And classical peace research, as it evolved during the Cold War, was not meant to be outside of security studies. It was an internal critique of security studies. So you had to learn the language of in order to defeat it from the inside. And I think we have, for good reasons, concentrated on many other things, maybe neglected a little bit this kind of environment, which I believe is unfortunately needed today. What do I mean by this? Well, international relations is a very peculiar environment for knowledge. So when I see epistemologies of peace, I think about where knowledge is produced. Because we have basically a different environment when a different history. Most of the social sciences, at least in the North and Western world, has been developing out of the functional differentiation of our societies. Civil society, the market is an autonomous environment. Indeed, the government is an autonomous environment from the state, gave rise to the social sciences, sociology, economics, and political science, but IR. International expertise predates this kind of environment. Basically, whatever you call it, Westphalia is not important as a single reference point, but the international has come into being earlier, and the expert knowledge of the international has come earlier. And so we didn't invent a discipline or a new science in order to better understand the world which was changing. We had an existing knowledge that we fitted into discipline, because now we need to justify that particular superior knowledge of the international. That means that practical knowledge is all the time in our environment. There's no knowledge system which is simply coming from the outside, observing from the academic environment or whatever else. There's always, and indeed, a very strong bias towards the ones who are running the show, that their knowledge, the practical knowledge, is the superior one. I mean, I don't know how many times you have been in the ministries of foreign affairs of this world, which are usually populated by similarly arrogant people in the academia. So they, when you tell them something that they don't agree with, they will say you're wrong. And if you tell them something they agree with, they will say that you're redundant. There's no role for you in principle. This nicety is usually, Kissinger has a wonderful phrase at some point retorted by the academics saying that you have to catch the ministry before they get into the ministry, because once they're in, it's too late. But it tells you something about this tension that exists between a practical knowledge, which is on the scene, on the stage, which defines where security, peace, and so on is going on, and an observational knowledge, which is the one that we usually have at the university. And that is stronger than in most of the other disciplines in the social sciences. I'm told business studies is close, because the firm, we need to know how the firm works. In that kind of an environment, classical peace research during the Cold War tried to be part of the security environment, yet undermine it. I mean, I'm pretty sure most of you have read in the past Carol Cohn's great piece on the defense intellectuals. In some sense, we are still there. It's still another world. It's still a world which very often doesn't necessarily speak the same language. And yet it's one of the practical languages within which the decisions are made. So either you leave it there, or you try to do something with it. And classical peace research tried to do something with it. So what was the inspiration? The inspiration was that, well, one should not confuse description with explanation. What do I mean by this? You have certainly heard zillions of times these days that look around, realism got it right. I mean, more conflict, therefore realism is right. It's of course nonsense. Because any theory will need to understand war and conflict, whether you're a realist, a constructivist, a liberal, whatever else. So it is not because things turn sour that realists are right, or things turn nice, that whatever you call them, idealists, liberals, and so on. That confuses description with explanation. And yet this is very common in our discipline. It wouldn't happen necessarily in any other. And therefore, the idea here behind this is that one would try to unpack this and make it understood that this is just a practical maxim, not necessarily something which is part of scientific knowledge. And in the past, that meant that the critique that peace research started from, at least in the European context from which I speak, was the critique of realist determinism. That there was no need to say that the security dilemma was necessarily there and cannot be overcome, because, well, there were vicious circles like arms race and so on, but there are also virtuous circles, and I will come to this in terms of diplomacy. So, to give you a little bit of my story, my peace research will end up with diplomacy. So what were the initial inspirations then of peace research during the Cold War? On the one hand, it was trying to understand where violence comes from. So it would be for the Kent School, it's really old, right? Self-esteem, human needs, and so on. It would be for people around Hamburg about the difficulty of combining state building, capitalism, and nationalism. But it would be also attempts to understand the military-industrial complex as a way in which arms race was not given as an action-reaction system, but an internal system of each side in which you were looking at the other in enemy images and reproducing the other side just to reproduce the insides of this. So the Cold War is what we make of it. This is what peace research was all about. The Cold War was not something inevitable. It was something which, with a virtuous circle, you could break. And you could therefore move from a war environment to a more peaceful environment. You would, as the Copenhagen School has it, de-securitize, because the Copenhagen School is not about securitization. Its principal concept is de-security. Now, what does that mean? It might mean that sometimes the way that enemy images are built up and the way they interact with particular identity discourses of certain countries, we reproduce pathologies, learning pathologies. This is what they called it at the time. In more modern scripture, you would have ontological security. When Jennifer Mitzen in the post-Cold War period wrote about it, it was about a pathology, because she wrote about the Americans needing desperately an enemy. They needed an enemy to stabilize that particular identity that they had built up during the Cold War. Actually, you might make the argument long before. So they were not looking for peace. They were looking for the enemy that would come, they would reinforce a certain vision of themselves. By the way, the expression vision of themselves, has been used by Kissinger. So it's a realist vision, even then. Or you have Lupovici, who's criticizing Israeli foreign policy long before the last wars, by saying that they built up a deterrent identity. And this deterrent identity means that states do not use deterrence to defend their security, but do security policy to defend their deterrent identity. Again, war might be not something that you're looking into, it's something you produce in order to stabilize a certain vision of Israel. These are classical examples of, well, maybe we can change this. And if we can change this, we would be getting out of the security dilemmas that we have. We would be within the very same world in which all these defense intellectuals are still kind of, not really, but at least trying to contaminate the types of discourses that exist in order to provide the space needed for that which would be a diplomacy worth its name. I give you the example of Ostpolitik, and I'm sorry for all the Eurocentrism, but it's meant basically as an example, not saying that everyone has to follow it, whatever else. An example as it existed in the past. The high point of Ostpolitik, the high point of détente, European détente policy, not the US détente policy, was Helsinki. The Helsinki Declaration. Basically, the attempt to accept the borders from the Second World War in exchange of making these borders more porous, making them having a different meaning, making them being more open. The kind of work that went into this is mind-boggling if you think about it from today. So the starting point was in Finland, because it was a Finnish initiative, taking a Soviet initiative or a Warsaw Pact initiative, retranslating. I met in the student union office of the Technical University of Helsinki for a couple of years, representatives of many, many countries in Europe. Then comes the second phase in Geneva, in which the official representatives of these countries have been negotiating for almost 2.5 years, meeting at least once a month, before coming with the final declaration that this one then signed in Helsinki. So the whole idea was that you provide the kind of confidence building environment. It takes lots of time for then implementing what was that which we didn't know that at the time, provided one of the impetus of the end of the Cold War. So diplomacy comes back as an important component because it's performative. So what do I mean by this? Diplomacy is most needed when it is least peaceful. Everyone will tell you when the war is on, we can't have diplomacy. It will not work. They can't meet. So diplomacy has this very strange position in which it has to produce the conditions for its very functioning. It has to assume to exist in order to be able to become existing, to come into being. It has to fake it to make it. It's a vicious or virtuous circle, and can work as a virtuous circle, but we are not sure it can. These research at that time tried to think about these international environments in which you would provide spaces, not always very visible, very often in the mid or long-term thinking, within which diplomacy would pretend to be around in order to make the conditions for its very existence possible. And that is what I just described with the Helsinki process. And I think there is something in there which is, of course, a very classical understanding of some form of peace. I'm not saying this is the only one, or maybe not, surely not the most interesting one, honestly. But it's one which, where we are going now, might seem to be quite interesting and important to be not forgotten. I don't know how much time I have.
Yeah, 7 minutes.
7 minutes, wow. Might not even need that. So, how do we get there? At the time, what was very important, what people thought was demilitarizing societies internally, even though you had a very heavy military budget. The two things to be thought together. And education. Because in order to make this feasible, people have to become conscious about the kind of dynamics that they are around. And they can be spoilers, obviously, quite easily. So the peace environment or the peace research at the time were inventing all possible statues of, well, I mean, I don't know how it is for you, but when I grew up, having a toy which was a war toy was a no-no. It didn't exist. So the kind of massive militarization that you see on war games around in the supermarkets, whatever else, it's something which was considered negative. And there was a state policy about it to try to keep it as little and as small as possible. The very idea that military solutions would be the main solutions for a society, internal of the society, would be considered completely off. While at the same time running a relatively high military budget and a huge number of people under arms because we were in the Cold War. Seems completely unthinkable today because the two things seem to be working together all the time, but they can be working also not all the time together. There's no need to assume from the beginning that the two have to be connected closely. They very often are. There is space for politics. Things are not just given. There is not a determinacy given by realism, the anarchy, the security dilemma, whatever else. Politics has to play a role. And the other one, where education plays a role is, well, people in this room. As Kissinger said, you have to catch them before they hit the ministry. And it's quite interesting that in some countries in which the recruitment in the ministries is no longer done just by lawyers and whatever else, there have been actually changes about ideas about strategies, how to go about foreign policy. That might work out, it might not always work out, but it's another type of peace education or peace work that you can have, which goes in this direction of desecuritizing. And where we would, at the end of the day, have an international environment which allows the other to be part of it, as in this diplomacy of, I mean, USSR was not a friendly, nice country next door. In environments in which there might be enemies, but in environments which we have to use the possibilities for those enemies not to get out of control in terms of the military interventions. So, we have an expert system where knowledge is produced that is usually driven by practical knowledge as it is in the ministries and in the military, but unfortunately also increasingly in the media. I mean, honestly, some of the articles in international affairs are mind-boggling. And they repeat exactly the kind of this confusion of explanation and description which I said before. And so a peace strategy in this environment is one that has to go against all of those. It has to be for the education, it has to go against an expert system which is reducing everything to determinism and to geopolitics, whatever that means. And I've written on it, so if you want to have more on it, it's actually translated into Portuguese. There is a nice translation on it. Exactly because geopolitics remilitarizes politics, it turns Clausewitz on its head. Politics is the prolongation of war with other means, i.e. war is the fallback. And it essentializes our identities, which has never produced nice environments. Our work in this kind of peace research is both, if you wish, on the street, it is in the toy shop, it is in educating future diplomats, but it is also in strongly, I hope, with diplomacy that takes itself seriously and is not just a marketing exercise of any foreign policy or any country. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mazzini. It's good to be reminded about, tradition or whatever, but because sometimes it's easier to get caught in the moment and forget about everything that came before us in terms of also knowledge production. And sometimes we think we're inventing things, but actually people have thought about it before and tested it. So That was really inspiring. Thank you so much. So now I'll pass the word to Sarah, Professor Sarah Jerry. Dr. Jerry is a peace and conflict scholar with degrees in conflict resolution and peace studies at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. Her research has generated critical insights on peace building and humanitarian policies and practice. Prior to joining SOAS, she was a research fellow with the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI, Overseas Development Institute. And before that, she was a postdoctoral research associate at the African Leadership Center at King's College London. She has experience of working and researching on conflict prevention, post-conflict peace building, humanitarian disarmament, advocacy, and development-related issues in Somaliland, Kenya, Ethiopia, Angola, and Sierra Leone, Tanzania, and Cambodia. Current themes of interest include peace building and post-conflict reconstruction, environmental peace building, mine action, humanitarian disarmament, and climate resilience. So I'll pass you over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberta, for inviting me to be in this panel, and also for me being in Brazil for the first time. I arrived this morning, so if I'm not coherent, you know why. And I've just been thinking about epistemologies of peace in general, but and I wanted to bring it home for me as a practitioner, but also policy, or what people now are calling academic, somebody who sits on the kind of intersection of policy and practice. And my observation, I draw very much from my work as researching the sector that is the humanitarian sector, that is landmine clearance. We know, places like Colombia, to bring it home for you, and other places where conflict has been, there are elements that are, or the material that is left on the ground that needs to be removed. And this is a huge sector, very, donor dependent, and also resource dependent. And so I draw from that, and I come from it, and I think I want to go back to how I came into research in such a place, and also ending up as a peace scholar, because that was never the plan. So I was working as a humanitarian actor, humanitarian aid worker in Nairobi. That's where I was born, in Kenya. And it was at a time when, in general, there was a lot of conflict, and there was a lot of refugees moving across borders. And I was working for a refugee organization that had a very strong sense of social justice issues. And therefore, this organization called the Jesuit Refugee Service decided that if there wasn't a landmines campaign in the respective countries where we were, that we were going to be the campaign. And therefore, at the point, I was a policy officer, and it landed on my desk, and I began campaigning to calling for a ban on landmines because of the impact that we were seeing. And how does that then relate to peace, you may ask? So during the times that I was working, the internet had just come to time. So that dates me quite well, doesn't it? So the internet was just booming, and I came across the website of the Bradford University Peace Studies program, and I read what was being provided. What the studies were. And they connected so much, very profoundly, in what I was doing. And that really surprised me, that actually what I was doing in Nairobi was an area of study. That was very difficult to comprehend. And when I applied to go to Bradford, and I told my then my line manager, he was very excited. He was British, so he knew the institution. He knew the people. I don't know if you're peace scholars, Professor Paul Rogers, who's always on the news commenting on what's, and he was quite, he was very surprised for me on how did I find out about this institution. So anyway, fast forward, I landed in Bradford and peace studies, conflict resolution, and I found myself writing and focusing a lot in what I had been doing previously. So all my essays were, on reflecting kind of a reflection on the, my work experience. And that, for me, when I think about how knowledge is produced or what we value as knowledge, for some and for a lot of local actors, and I draw very much on local partners and local action, we do not sometimes think about it as peace, or we do not see the linkages of how these issues are related, or we do not see that as knowledge. Because the knowledge in the way, the dominant form of knowledge in peace and peace studies is the knowledge that is in the Journal of Peace Building, for example, or whatever journals. That's the knowledge that is valued. It's never the knowledge that the local partners, the local organizations will have. And unfortunately, and I fast forward this when I had another profound moment where we were running a workshop on and the topic was knowledge production. And some of the participants were from the Eastern African region, scholars from the Eastern African region, and one of them stood up and challenged us and says, but how do we quantify knowledge from societies that are very, very verbal? For them, the communication, the issues are about, are passed from word of mouth. How do we quantify that? How is that shared even? And so I draw back into my own research. So I looked at the work of mind clearance organizations, and I deliberately went for a lens of the liberal peace building lens. And it was a very difficult and interesting process in terms of how do I conceptualize something as very that has been previously been looked at from a military perspective or from a security perspective, from usually a medical practice, from the impact of mines and explosive weapons on civilians. How do you then bring that to and use a peace building lens with that? So, and I went back to looking at how, for example, the UN has looked at issues on landmines and landmines contamination. And I chanced on the agenda for peace, Boutros Ghali, and when he was the agenda for peace was being kind of launched, one of the activities that was listed as part of peace building was addressing the issues of landmines. And for me, that gave me the kind of, this is the normative framing that I wanted to look at, to go for. But then the other thing I wanted to find out was, if the UN, if that's the way it's conceptualized, how do the mine action people, the people who are responding to this crisis, the humanitarians who are responding to this crisis, how do they define it? Where do they see a landmine clearance in terms of whether it was peace building or not? So that was one of the questions that I had. And also, I wanted to find out the communities that were living in some of these places. Did they see that as peace building? And what was interesting, and what I came to, and my case study was Somaliland. I don't know how many of you here have heard of Somaliland. Yeah, quite a few. All right, yeah, sure. So Somaliland was an interesting case study. It's not a recognized entity, and it had gone through a very difficult conflict period during their civil war. But in 91, after the fall of Said Barre's regime in Somaliland announced that they were seceding from Somalia, and they announced their own independence, and they took a very different path towards peace. And this was led by the local clans, the clan elders. So Somaliland is the kind of the dynamics rather than tribes. Somaliland has clans, and because of their colonial experience, they had undergone what is an indirect colonial rule by the British. Their institutions had been left intact. And therefore, they were able to draw on their own mechanism, conflict resolution mechanisms, to be able to address the challenges that were before them. And interestingly, one of the only things that the clan elders, when they were going through the reconciliation process and they were agreeing on the terms of the peace that they were now reframing, was that mine clearance was going to be one of the area where all of them were kind of united in their approach. So effectively, the clan elders put mine clearance at the heart of peace and peace building. And they had a very practical way in which they were going to do. This is the 1991. So the whole drama of DDR and all that was not part of the discourse. It wasn't even being discussed at the time. So what they agreed on was they were going to use their own former soldiers who had probably been laying mines previously. They were going to use them to do the clearance because, in a sense, they were going to then present to the communities a show that to bring confidence that these people are no longer agents of war and now they're agents of peace. So the ex-combatants were going to do the mine clearance. It was ingenious. In fact, I was thinking the other day that if I were the elders, I would have patented the DDR template because that's what they do. Basically, they were saying these soldiers, they were reintegrating back into society. They were thinking about disarmament and demobilization by simply that act. But then they did not have any of the templates of the liberal peace building agendas, or where they have, the kind of templates in terms of addressing peace and or in terms of addressing conflict. So what was interesting for me is that is happening on one hand, and then I spoke to some of these people who've been working on that in that space. But on the other hand, I wanted to find out from the people who are doing peace building in Somaliland, whose mandate or whose kind of organization meant that they or part of the mandate was that they were doing peace building. And I asked the question on whether mine action was part of peace building, whether they thought it was part of peace building. And they categorically said no. Which is, rather interesting. Your clan elders have put this into the heart of it. And the interesting part for me was that what had happened over time, Somaliland people, the communities, had agreed, or because of the history that they had gone through, for them, the communities, and for everybody else, peace building was only by elders, was what the elders did. It had nothing else to do with anything other than the reconciliation process, other than the state building process that they had gone through. So that's how they conceptualized peace and peace building. But on the other hand, it was also because of the way those who had come in much later, the international community, the mine clearance organizations, their posture on the ground, their everyday practices, that they did not associate that with peace and peace building. So it was, in a way, when I was trying to think through about the conversation today, it was local knowledge, indigenous local knowledge, and then at some point the co-optation of the way in which, I'll rephrase that. So it's the local knowledge, but it's also the history that is shaping the way, the perception of peace. But it's also the everyday practices of an entirely different organization. And so it is not as simple as peace building for Somaliland is peace, and not that. There is much more. And if you then look at peace building, if you're examining peace building from a liberal peace building perspective, you'll miss the nuances that there is in understanding the local context of most of these people. So in terms of then how this knowledge is packaged, is we see that Somaliland as a case study is being overstudied in the extent to which it is speaking to state building and the way the processes of kind of the democratization process that it has gone through. But when you think about what else is missing from that narrative, for me, I place mind clearance at the heart. It was foundational to anything else that was done, because without the clearance, none of the activities that have, Somaliland today is a thriving place, but facilitated by mind clearance. So what am I trying to say in this narrative? Is that as peace scholars, the challenge for us is not to regurgitate look at places like Somaliland just as a hybrid example of peace building. There is much more to it, not just as a success story for state building, but there are other activities that are marginalized, that are on the periphery of academia. So if you look for scholars who are looking at mine action more generally, you'll find very few. And that is because some spaces, some contexts, and some activities are very much marginalized and on the periphery. And so for me, as a scholar in peace and being based in development studies, teaching humanitarianism and development, is to always challenge my students, my master students, and say, have you thought about that? Because there needs to be knowledge that is emerging from issues that are on the periphery, issues that are blind, but that are at the core of what it is that we think, where it is that we should be when we think about peace. When you think about Ukraine today, you think about Palestine, you think about all the other places that are at war today, the most fundamental activity that will have to be undertaken before all the refugees return, before all the reconciliation and communities are reunited, is to clear the debris of war. And without that, the peace is going to be very difficult. What else did I want to say in conclusion? Maybe I'll save some of the remarks for the question and answer, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fascinating and really makes us pay attention. There's a lot of discussion on invisibilizing voices, right? We'll get more into this in other panels as well. So now let me introduce you to our third special speaker, Marcos Alva Ferreira. Marcos Alva Ferreira is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at the Federal University of Paraíba. And he's also a visiting professor at Masters in Social Development at the University of NUR in Bolivia. He holds a PhD in Political Science from Universidade Estadual de Campinas and a Master's degree in International Relations by the Programa Santiago Dantas, UNESP, Unicamp PUC São Paulo. He was a visiting researcher at the University of Manchester, Uppsala University, and also University of São Paulo. As visiting professor, he conducted classes and talks, and also at the University of Arts in London and Universidade Redonda. I'm sure I'm pronouncing right. It is a member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, GI, TOC, Switzerland. He's published extensively his studies, but also discussing in organized crime in Brazil. And I'll pass the floor to Marcos. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. It's a pleasure to be here at the round table and Sarah. And my talk will be a dialogue with colleague Sarah, and bringing a topic that's often neglected in the epistemologies of peace. And I start bringing a question. And why blues and peace and conflict studies pay so little attention to the forms of violence that shape everyday life in countries like Brazil, South Africa, or Mexico? Violence often treated as secondary, as reflecting the very small number of publications on this context in leading peace and conflict study centers. And these countries I mentioned are among the most lethal regions in the world, and yet they are rarely considered conflict zones. The realities are far less integrated into core debates about peace, conflict transformation, or security than those in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. A dominant explanation I have heard repeatedly in academic space is that violence described as criminal is economically driven, and so not necessarily a political issue. Because of this, is regarded as a topic for criminology, urban studies, or public policy, not for peace and conflict studies. It's also rarely considered relevant by international organizations dedicated to promoting peace, of course, an exception is the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, which tended to focus almost exclusively on contexts marked by insurgency, civil war, or overt political rebellion. But in my here in this space that I have, I want to argue the opposite. Even when violence includes economic incentives, it produces political order, governance, legitimacy, and deep restrictions on peace formation. Moreover, this is highly lethal violence that affects millions of people every day, which should place it at the center of peace and conflict studies. After all, peace and conflict studies is fundamentally concerned with understanding how to reduce violence in its three dimensions: direct, structural, and cultural, in order to advance more sustainable forms of peace. As we know, and as Stefano introduced it very well for us, peace and conflict studies was developed built mainly around civil wars, ideological insurgencies, and interstate disputes, conflicts that directly challenge state sovereignty. But in its first years, peace and conflict studies, it started strongly grounded in a transdisciplinary approach, creating bridge between the political and the violence as a social problem. But it's now much more state-centric. Most of the analyses are focused in how the conflict impacts the state, not looking always to the impacts in the society in general. And here we have a paradox, because in much of the global south, violence is not directed against the state, it's directed against the society, as we see in the criminal violence we see in Latin America. It unfolds within the state, along with state authority, or through hybrid configurations that do not always resemble rebellion or war. Once violence is labeled as criminal, it becomes intellectually and institutionally displaced in peace and conflict study. It is treated as a matter of public security, policy, or governance reform, but not necessarily a topic for peace studies. This classification shapes what peace and conflict studies considers work of analysis. It pushes entire regions like Brazil, like Mexico, outside the field's conceptual map, and it prevents us from seeing that the political is unfolding in a space that peace and conflict studies have learned to treat as non-political. To understand why this is inadequate, I suggest we must examine the structural and symbolic foundations of violence in this context. In a recent paper on violence in Brazil, written with Roberta, my colleague in several publications, we argue that lethal violence cannot be explained without recognizing that in countries like Mexico or like Brazil, we have a racial hierarchy, colonial legacies, aporophobia against some groups of the populations, and also a strong urban marginalization. Symbolic and cultural violence define who becomes killable, who is protected, and who can be abandoned by the state. The boundaries between public authority and private coercion have always been porous. These structural foundations are political, not peripheral. Contemporary violence reproduces older orders. It's not a variation of market incentives. It's built on political structures of inequality that peace and conflict studies lacks the epistemological tools to see. And capture these foundations require qualitative, context-sensitive methodologies, anchored in deep social and cultural knowledge. Methodologies that peace and conflict studies, at least in some journals, does not always prioritize, especially when we examine the strong emphasis in quantitative importance journals, like Journal of Peace Studies and Journal of Conflict Resolution. Another central aspect, and often overlooked, is the nature of governance exercised by actors labeled as criminals. In Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and South Africa, these organizations govern concrete aspects of daily life. They mediate disputes, regulate mobility, enforce curfews, impose rules, collect taxes, deliver welfare, and generate predictability. These are governance functions, and of course, a political issue that needs to be discussed also. Yes, they pursue also economic profit, as we know, but economic incentives coexist with de facto authority. Their practices shape citizenship, rights, belonging, and even the experience of sovereignty in marginalized territories. What we observe in this case is not the absence of the state, but a configuration where state, crime, and market actors form assemblages of authority. Understanding these dynamics require methods capable of capturing social meaning, local legitimacy, and relational authority. Precisely what qualitative approaches bring more carefully. It's also important to highlight that even amidst high level of violence, communities develop everyday practice of coexistence, trying to bring peace in contexts like we see in Latin America. They also practice resilience and negotiation. These practices are forms of peace formation that we see in Latin America. But criminal orders also constrain these possibilities. They regulate who can speak publicly. They determine who can organize. They influence who can negotiate with state actors. This severely restricts bottom-up peace formation in several urban areas in Latin America. It curtails civil societies and limits the possibility of transformation from below. And peace and conflict studies need to look to this peace formation that's blocked by some of these actors and sometimes by the state itself with the repression that in a single morning kill more than 100 people here in Rio de Janeiro, for example. And peace and conflict study rarely address this blockage because it rarely sees criminal governance as a peace issue. But if peace depends on the naval agency, voice, and social mobilization, then criminal authority is an essential obstacle that must be analytically centered. And this brings some implications for epistemologies for peace. That's the topic of this roundtable. These reflections that I introduce point to three necessary epistemological shifts. First, should discuss and expand what we understand by the political. Violence that shapes citizenship, authority, and that everyday life is political, even without ideology or rebellion, or even if it's economically driven. Also, it's important to bring the discussion about sovereignty. Authority is highly monopolized in several countries in Latin America. It is negotiated, disputed, and shared among state and criminal non-state actors in countries like Brazil and Mexico, just to give an example. And also, I think that in this case, and look to Latin America in particular, it's very important to bring the roots of the peace studies and in the first years when was a key topic to discuss structural and symbolic violence. Peace analysis must begin with racialized inequality, histories of exclusion, and cultural violence, which requires qualitative, grounded, and context-aware research. To conclude, cases like the violence seen in Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa must be more central in peace and conflict studies. It's not a political criminality, it's a political order rooted in structural inequality and in a hybrid governance. Criminal actors may be economically driven, but their actions reshape the everyday conditions of peace for millions of people. And the state is often part of the problem, through forms of collusion with criminal groups or through the selective use of brutal force that targets specific territories and populations. In Brazil, this is evident in the favelas, where Afro-Brazilian and materially deprived communities are concentrated, and where police operations routinely produce high levels of lethal violence. By contrast, in the elite condos with documented connections to criminal networks, the police hardly fire a single shot. If peace and conflict studies continues to examine these dynamics as secondary, it will fail to understand some of the world's most violent regions, including the ones we belong to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcos. And well, I think this is the first panel today, the first session where actually we have plenty of time to discuss. Usually academics tend to speak longer, but I really appreciate because I think it's really important to have some time for discussion. So I'll just open the floor for questions, and please raise your hand, tell your name and your institution or what you do, and let's start the debate. And should I start with okay. Do you want to say something? No. Okay. Yes, please. Yeah,
English report, please. English report, please.
Can you speak in English? Just because, well, she doesn't speak, but
So far, this.
we can a gente pode traduzir, se você preferir.
Eu prefiro. Só. Eu me chamo Renata Lins, do trabalho de paz, principalmente ativismo, justiça. E é um pouco direcionado para o Marcos. E a pergunta que você está trazendo sobre a gente olhar os estudos de paz, e principalmente o Brasil, que em números absolutos é o lugar onde tem mais homicídios. E quando a gente olha para a juventude do Brasil, a gente vê que a grande parte dessas pessoas estão sendo mortas. E eu queria entender a relação que você vê em relação dessas mortes, né, o Estado como sendo um dos problemas dentro de paz e conflito, para a construção de paz, mas também essa questão em relação ao crime organizado, que eu sei que você estuda fortemente em relação a isso, e relacionar a questão do tráfico de droga, a participação de crianças no tráfico de drogas, se isso tem uma relação direta com a questão de crianças em conflitos armados também, quando a gente tem uma abordagem, um olhar de estudo de paz. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Renata. Maybe, talvez mais umas duas questões. Assim, so we have two extra questions, then we can do first round of answers and then.
Hello everyone, can you hear me? Oi. So, eu vou falar em inglês. So, my idea here is to, in a way, propose a question or ask for a commentary from the table, from everyone, but also to propose this as something to think in the space we are gathering here today. Because there's a question that has been running in my mind throughout this year in these places where we gather, congresses, forums, and is the world getting more peaceful just because we are gathered here? So this is a question that to me always touches on the ivory tower, Torre de Marfim, as we as academics get isolated in these spaces, and what we talk so much about does not get translated directly to the world. And a tutor that I have there in Trinity College, London, she told me it's not because we're studying it that it has any direct impact in peace. Unfortunately, it's not causal. There's correlation, but unfortunately, it's not, because I wish that if I studied 24 hours of peace, the world would get 24 hours better. I don't know, the impact of we studying more and doing this kind of research, the world getting better. And I read this in the moment we're going through right now. I really liked what Professor Stefano Goscini brought, because he brings us to think about the classical approach to peace, but we need to go beyond that. So when we look to our world today, I do also recollect something I had from my advisor. He said, moving forward, it's not that we are retroceding, but it's still a regress. Não é retrocesso, mas é regresso ao que eram os estudos para a paz. So I really would like to hear a comment from the table on that, about what we are doing and how this translates to all the challenges we're facing nowadays. Thank you.
Third question?
A minha pergunta também é para o professor Mário, e ecoa com a da Renata. Eu não sei se o professor está habituado com o trabalho da Sayag Valência. Ela é uma ativista mexicana. Ela escreveu, acho que no início dos anos 2020, mas foi publicado no Brasil agora esse ano, um livro chamado War Capitalism, onde ela ataca a morte e a violência como um produto, e um produto específico da fase de hiperconsumo do capitalismo. E ela cita o Estado como o ator principal. Então, se o professor pudesse desenvolver um pouco mais essa ideia, principalmente a partir da visão neoliberal do Estado que a gente tem hoje. Muito obrigada. Eu adorei todas as falas.
Obrigada. Tá, vou pegar mais uma e aí a gente tem o primeiro round, and then next we have a second round. Discussão.
I'd like to congratulate you all professors for the speeches, and I'd like to ask about the role of the religion in achieving the peace, and more maybe defining what is peace. That's all.
Okay, we have several $1 million questions. If you guys know how to interact, or keys, but I'll leave it to. So I suggest we follow the order. So there's some.
Freya, where should I start? Thank you for the questions. Obviously, that I will not have an easy answer for them, because all the answers you have already given. There's a frustration that we reach not that far out that we maybe used to, although I'm not so sure about that one. Many do, on the other hand. I mean, media is full of experts which have academic credentials, the recruitment in many of the major organizations is done also people who have done academic work. So in a certain sense, one should they are there. Whether they always have an effect is a different question. Whether teaching is for you useful or not in that regard is having an effect is also a different question. So I think it is, but I'm not sure this gets us anywhere closer out of. I'm not so sure I would like to the expression of the ivory tower. Not that this doesn't exist, but I think there is a need of being bilingual. Maybe that we need to have a level in which we have a language of observation with which we are having a certain distance understand. But at the same time, we need also to be fluent in the practical language, indeed also in the local mode. So reducing it to one of those, because otherwise we are in the ivory tower, will contradict the very position in which we are in. If that is your idea, then you should abolish all the universities. I think there's a need for both, and there's a need for being able to translate between the two. And that is something that in our education we should be looking for, whether or not that gets us out of the conundrum that you have been referring to. It's truly going beyond classical peace research. As I said from the very beginning, this is my role here. This is one and not the only one, but that would be my first answer for the role of religion. Because the idea behind this would be that there could be a moral that would be able to inform people across different worldview civilizations to meet, not necessarily because they have the same religion, but because they are religious in themselves and therefore accept the possibility of superior moral standards according to which they should behave rather than the whatever homo economicus and so on. Is this roughly what you are after? I wish. I think it's a possibility because, of course, peace research, as defined here, is a normative, is both observational, but it's surely a normative environment, and it would be a possibility to mobilize, perhaps across different environments, something on which translation is possible, where you invite the other into your home, and you will be invited in the home of the other. Which is what Spivak would be thinking of, or in terms of translation. That this is not necessarily always working has to do with the fact that religion is very often connected to identities. Then we essentialize identities, we homogenize identities, and then it becomes a part of the problem rather than parts of the solution. But then it is not religion or the moral environment which is the important one, but basically that you are part of one club rather than the other club. So the first one, yes, let's hope, but very often it's the second, and it will be only getting worse in the kind of geopolitics of religion that we are seeing very often around. I mean, the clash of civilization, other stupid but incredibly or effective things. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer either of the questions, but I'll try. I mean, about the fact that we are in the academic spaces and the idea of the ivory tower is that the movement on we understand. I think we're understanding the dynamics of peace and conflict more, and thanks to I imagine in the past when we were talking about the Iraq Iraq conflict or the previous conflict before the CNN effect, what we call the CNN effect, that we knew very little about the dynamics of that. The extent to which whether at that period of time we had less conflict is a different matter altogether. And I wonder whether the wars now are more wars of a different nature. When I see about, for example, the the cyber conflict, the cyber wars, and or even the modes of war now, where you don't have to have the boots on the ground because you can, it's the question maybe is how that is transformed. But I think also by us having the peace studies as a discipline, that seeks to understand how some of these issues helps in us kind of analyzing and putting that forward. I'll tell you what, when I first finished my PhD, I was I just did not see the point in doing any research anymore. And I for a long time, I didn't publish anything because I thought, what's the point? Nobody's ever going to read it. But now I think about it and I think, who's going to tell the story about the 60 ex-combatants in Somaliland who took upon themselves to do that kind of dangerous work if a peace scholar doesn't go in and do that. So while it's an ivory tower to a certain extent, I think we help in terms of bringing those kind of, I hesitate to say marginalized or invisibilized activities. And maybe, I think I'm being very, very incoherent here, but I'll leave it at that because I think there are various ways in which you can answer that question, whether are we being more peaceful, or are we thinking about the classic humanitarian, what the classic humanitarian aid worker will say, we are working ourselves out of a job. And then on the next instance, you hear, for example, the chief executive of Hello Trust, the largest humanitarian demining organization, saying that it's all right for Biden to transfer landmines to whatever. I mean, he's, so are we really wanting to dig ourselves out of this, whatever? So you can look at it in different ways, in the sense that we I think, understand a bit more about these things, and we are documenting and we are writing and we are reflecting and challenging as well, challenging some of the narratives out there. Whether we are being made more peaceful, I'm not so sure. The role of religion, and I think in terms of religion as broadly defined, I think about sometimes the fundamental, the kind of religion that I'm seeing, especially in my country, in Kenya, the explosion of Christian, Christianity in what other people call fundamental. Is it fundamental? What's the word? I can't remember now. Where it's almost a kind of a conflict in itself, with different groups are emerging and competing and putting the same communities. When you think about peace as a social justice issue, putting these communities in further poverty, in more vulnerability in terms of the impact it's having in terms of poor people's kind of pouncing on the vulnerability, the poverty that is there for communities. It makes me really wonder about whether the way we understand war and peace maybe should change. And I think maybe it goes back to what you were saying about violence and how that is conceptualized. How do we understand some of the very deep issues. I mean, we in Kenya, for example, most recently, there's a church where I think over 100 people died because they were fasting. They were being told to not to eat. So you're preying on the poverty and vulnerabilities of people. And that might not be war necessarily as we understand it, but it is a different kind of violence for people. So I think, I think is religion helping us achieve peace? I think if we look into any of the religious group, we can find pockets of where, peace is a concept, as an idea, is whatever. But you can also find war and how war and this context, discord is also within the same religious group. So I guess that's a huge question that I have no whatever of answering beyond that. Sorry.
Well, thank you for the very interesting questions. I begin with the discussion about the youth. I think it's key. And when we talk, for example, the kind of violence that we see in Latin America, particularly, and when we talk which groups are more directed to, are more affected by the violence, the youth is, I think, one's the first. And particularly in Brazil or even Mexico, I think it's important the state consider how to bring public policies for this group, but also how the civil society and bring the discussion about overcoming violence and peace to this group. And particularly when we talk about the criminal groups, and it's important we have clear that they reproduces a violence against this youth historically. So if the capitalism in some way make difficult for the youth to find jobs and to have a participation in the society, sometimes the organized crimes gives a job for them, and then they became engaged in the organized crime. But at the same time, we reproduce the killings and so on with this youth. So we need to sometimes also to see not only the organized crime as a result of in a society that's unequal, but also they reproduce this inequality, and the youth in particular is where we see this inequality more strongly, I think. And regarding the question, is the world getting more peaceful? Of course, that I also don't have the answer as my colleagues, but I think it depends which group you are. We are doing this question, no? And I'd like to bring an experience from the research that Roberta and I did with the youth in Belo Horizonte and also in João Pessoa, and also some of my students. Some of them are here. We do in a public school in João Pessoa. And the response is about what's violence and what is peace is very different when we talk with the youth, for example, dialoguing also with your question. So, for example, in some of these activities that we're trying to bring to this youth in a private neighborhood in João Pessoa, Northeast Brazil, when we talk about what is the main violence that you suffer to a guy, he probably you say, well, I'm afraid of the criminal groups. But when we do the same question for a girl, the response is absolutely different, because we will become, for example, the question of harassment, and we see several layers of why they not feel peace in the environment where they live. You understand? And of course, I'm trying to bring here a picture from the youth and from our research. But when we make a question, do you feel that you live in an environment of peace in a same group, in a same territory? You have different responses depending which group you are asking the same question. No? And regarding the relation between the killing and violence and the product of capitalism, we see this very clearly in the topic that I explored here. That's the criminal violence and how this affects the peace in the Latin America in particular, because we have people from the elites that are engaged in the organized crime, and they are in the top, but it's not necessarily the people that are killed. The people are killed from the both sides. Let's see, like sides, even though I don't like to make this division, but we divide police and the organized crime, for example. The people that's killed is almost the same, because the police that sometimes lost their lives in a raid is the ones that also sometimes lives in the favelas, not necessarily the top police, the chief that sometimes is connected to the corruption, for example. So because that I bring back again what I introduced in my talk, the importance of to bring the structural violence to the center of debate of peace studies. Because the structural violence sometimes can, when we reflect about this, can bring more ideas and more reflections that, and the blockage to peace is not only the direct violence that often we see in the top journals in peace and conflict studies, but in the case like Brazil, in the case like South Africa and others, the structural violence is central to understand if you want to understand this violence that affects the people. And regarding the question about the role of religion, and of course that I also don't have the answer, but I'd like to bring another aspect that I think that's important to this discussion, that even though we are an atheist or don't like religion in some way, I think it's important to bring the religion to this debate also about peace, and because two reasons I think. First, there are few social forces in the society that has the capacity of mobilization as the religion has. So if we go to trying to find in which social space in Rio de Janeiro or in Nairobi or I don't know in Stockholm can mobilize and bring 100 people, 200 people together in a night of Saturday or on Sunday, we will feel very few groups, and the religion will be the main one. And so the capacity of mobilization and the capacity of the communication of this group cannot be neglected if we want to understand or if we want to overcome violence. I think it's important to bring the leaders and the religion to the center of the debate and to the discussion also. And the second point is that in much cases, the first group that will bring some support in the case of violence is the religious leaders. We are talking about this in the workshop at the morning, and an activist that work in the peripheries here in Rio de Janeiro said, well, I have several problems with the Universal Church, that's the evangelical church we have in Brazil, but they were the first one that arrived in the raid of the police in the Complexo do Alemão, and bringing some comfort for the people. The priests from the Catholic Church was the first one that arrived. It was not the state. It was the religious leaders that was there in some way trying to understand what happened and why the police did a raid that killed 100 people. So I just bring this to some reflections that even though we don't think it's important for our daily lives, it's important to the society. It's a force a social force that's important to the society. So because this is important to bring to this discussion on peace and to overcome violence.
Thank you, Marcos. I think we have 4 minutes. Maybe there's 1 or 2 extra questions. And may I use my power as moderator just to make a quick comment as well? Just regarding the ivory tower thing. One of the things that bothers me sometimes in our field is that it's still quite sometimes very dualistic. it's either you have peace or violence, etc. And life is so much more in the gray zone or the colorful zone. I don't know, you know. So even when you have wars, even in a world war, you still have peace happening. But we tend to focus on war. But then when there is a moment of peace, we still focus on the violence. So peace never wins in terms of what we see, right? But it's always there. So regarding just the ivory tower, I think we just need to switch our gaze a little bit, because I think there is an impact, and sometimes local scale, global scale, you know, I think that there's a learning process, but we're never going to be able to quantify. You quantify war because someone in, you know, Uppsala goes and okay, when 1,000 people die, blah blah blah. You don't have this for peace, right? So it's easier to quantify and say, okay, it's been more or less violent, but because especially here we use everything, well, there will never be peace if you just, you know, put everything in it. But if you look at the pieces of peace, I think it brings a better gaze. So that's just a provocation. But if anyone has any more questions, yes.
Yeah, I've got one. My name is Gabriela, and I'm from VII. I'm a PhD candidate here. And well, I think my comment has to do with what you have just commented. And the colleague has put as what we as scholars are doing in terms of constructing knowledge that would be maybe truly instrumentalized as part of solution for violence, and therefore lead to some peace, more peace. And I think first I would like to ask who are we? Who are the actors and actresses of peace? Because I think it's really important to keep it the gaze, as you said, Roberta. Who are doing peace, or what we imagine as peace on the ground. And I always think in terms, even if there's an unequal power relation where some people are deemed less protectable by the state, what are these people doing to survival? And I don't want to romanticize survival with this, but what I want to say is how to think maybe in collaboration with grassroots movements, social movements, in order to see what's been built as peace, but not itself labeled as that many times. So what is maybe replacing peace as a category, as a concept for these movements? And I'm saying this because I research on Una Menos, which is a collective, and also transnational feminist movement in Argentina. And I was trying, I'm trying to think of insecurity issues using what seemed to be an alternative vocabulary regarding this movement. And so what are the paths for peace for them? And I don't know, but maybe it's care, it's solidarity, it's the building of webs of self-protection. And so my provocation is this, who we think to be the actors and actresses of peace? And I think it has to do with what Professor Sarah said. We're doing peace without sometimes even not knowing they're engaging with peace itself. And I would like to know if you're fond of this approach in your researches, you know, to think peace through struggles and movements and resistance and activism. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think one very quick question to end, and then we'll have, okay, two very, very quick questions. All the time.
My name is Eduardo Bechara Gomez from the School of Government and Public Policy at External Columbia University in Bogota. My question is, back in the day, liberal peace seemed like the main dominant framework or label in terms of peace building, and seems to be, back in the day, in tune with liberal democracy, with economic liberalization, and with, for instance, granting rights in terms of rights for women, LGBTQ community, migrants. But right now we have a whole different picture. The world is now rather reactionary. There is a democratic backsliding that it's not exclusive from the global south, but we can see it in the global north. The United States, for example, to make one big example. And in terms of commercial trade wars, and also like a reversal of rights. So how do we make sense of peace in this kind of reactionary world? How do we label it? It's a short question and it's not an easy question, of course, but thank you so much.
Okay, very quick to conclude, and then we have like 1 minute to put your final thoughts together, and then we continue because we still have we have to switch venue to go to the sessão de boas-vindas.
Hi, good evening. So I'll say it in English, and maybe some parts will be in Portuguese. It will be easier to express myself. My name is Cecilia. I study food security and international relations. I'm an international relations graduate student at Universidade Federal de Paraíba. I was a student with, felizmente, aluna de professor Marcos Alba. É um prazer estar aqui, inclusive. So my question would be towards him, but the whole table, I'm sure, can answer that too. As I'm related to my field, my question is more related to violence, and my vision of this is a result of maybe desigualdades sociais latentes na sociedade. Então, I don't see how we can talk about peace and violence, of course, without talking about these desigualdades. So my question is, how can we apply the field of peace studies, and how can we maybe relate them with the other fields of the other studies, so that we can maybe see some results that intercalam os estudos, e aí eu vou trazer tudo em português, desculpa. Como a gente pode intercalar os estudos de paz junto com outros estudos que também abordam as desigualdades sociais que a gente vê por aí afora, e como talvez que a gente pode ver um futuro mesmo. Porque eu sei que já tem iniciativas, eu sei que já tem pesquisadores, o próprio professor Marcos Alba já vê que tem pesquisas e iniciativas nesse sentido de trazer os estudos da paz para outros estudos que relacionam, por exemplo, talvez gênero, talvez a própria questão da insegurança alimentar, mas como então que a gente pode fortalecer ainda mais essa junção, essa visão talvez holística, por assim dizer, e um campo de estudos de paz ainda mais amplo, se é que pode ser ainda mais amplo do que o termo paz.
Obrigada. Thank you. So I'll give like a minute for you to be really objective and show people that we can be objective and succinct as academics.
All right. Who are the actors of peace? Everyone and no one. We can all be actors of peace in different ways. And so there's also the invitation of the thing that you have to combine all potential agencies of peace in one person. Maybe you can't, but there's a division of labor. How to think peace in a reactionary world when you no longer can assume that there's a kind of consensus about a normative environment. I mean, there's the crisis of the international order kind of thing, right? Which is the US. Well, it will work. Therefore, I insisted so much in the beginning. We didn't have similar ideologies. So we had to find a space in which diversity of ideologies have to be rethought, in context in which pragmatic solutions have to be found in order to avoid bigger wars. You might have the environment as one of the pushes. And one of those explained is surviving diplomatic initiatives, which are very large, is it's not perhaps by coincidence. And here again, you are concentrating by looking at fields which are not necessarily connected to particular moral environments, but to common problems, by which then you define how to go about it. Very classic type of diplomacy. Therefore, I somewhat insisted in it. And the final remark, because I was really, I liked the way that you connected the political with knowledge. So we have on the table 3 different worlds of knowledge, right? The world of the practical knowledge, which I would like to see them redone by peace research, which is not quantitative, because it is about human needs, it is about inequality, it is about the difficulty of state formation, capitalism, and nation building to go on at the same time. And if you miss one, then there will be violence coming up, like organized crime, where state building doesn't really work. I mean, as an Italian, I would say, I would wish organized crime were politically. And then we have the knowledge of the peace building core coming into a local environment, which marginalizes another one. So here there's particular peace research tradition marginalized, there's a local knowledge which is marginalized. And in yours, it's the academic knowledge where a part of the non-quantitative academic knowledge has been mounted. Where politics comes in as that which is the process, right? It's that which is in between the input and the output, when everything is explained roughly in that middle, but they just look at the 2 slides on the side. So I thought it was a very nice way of putting it through there.
Thank you, Stefan. Yeah. Just a very quick one, especially on who defines on the peace actors. I think the question for me would be who defines peace, and maybe I really like the concept, the idea of everyday peace and everyday peace indicators. I found that has resonates quite a lot in my work, but also I think. Maybe it's time for us as Global South scholars to start to reconceptualize what peace and peace building is. You know, we can, you know, just as you kind of theorize, but also you know, when you're putting together a framework that you want, just as we're able to do that, I think we can put an agenda where we can begin to challenge, you know, what is there, and if you know, if we do it incrementally, you know, then we can be able to redefine the agenda, and that goes also in terms of how we share this knowledge and what becomes then the dominant narrative. In terms of the liberal peace building question, I wondered, you know, I think I go back to what Roberta said earlier about turning the gaze. So liberal peace building agenda was mainly a framework for looking at post-conflict context. Yeah. Do you use that same kind of lens when you think about the political violence in the US, for example? Are we having more and more case studies of looking at why the liberal peace agenda has failed in the US? But you know, we don't get that kind of. So it's also our role to, I think, to kind of change of the gaze and start using some of these frameworks to look at completely different dynamics that could maybe then get people thinking about some of the issues. Probably far-fetched idea, but who knows, we could be talking about something else. I think we ought to rethink the case studies that we also are looking at, just as we are changing the issues. For example, we are calling for activities like mine clearance, as peace building, as the work that you're doing, you know, bringing that into the front, the discussions on peace studies. It is difficult, it's challenging. And one of the ways it's challenging is also who's publishing. For example, I have an article that my latest paper took at least 4 years on the process before it was published because they couldn't find reviewers. In the end, they had to call me to say, we can't find a reviewer, could you suggest someone? This is how difficult it is when you want to publish on a topic that is not, it's not the dominant narrative out there, so I'll leave it at that.
Yes. Starting with the question about who are the actors of peace, as Dr. Gusini said, everyone is the actor, but also we see that the actors who works more for the peace is mainly the ones that suffer more violence. I'm looking from the side of Latin America in particular. And so, as you said, the feminist movement and also the Afro-Brazilian social movements is the ones of more active to reduce violence because they suffer daily this life more strongly than any other group. So even though we are all the actors, we see, particularly looking to the case of Brazil, that the actors that work more strongly for the peace is the ones that suffer more violence. And regarding the question of Cecilia, thanks for your question. I think that I think that we need to rebuild some interesting foundations from the beginning of peace studies, integrating transdisciplinary work and dialoguing with sociology and also even with economics, no? And to reflect that peace studies is not only a political issue, it's a social issue, it's an economic issue. And for example, in the area that you research, that's food security, is not only a political topic, it's a social topic, it's an economic topic. So what we can integrate from these other perspectives, or even when we talk about structural violence, is not only a politically driven, it's connected with the way we think and the way we live, no? So, and I think that's important. Of course, that's more difficult because we need to leave our comfort zone that we are only in our field, and also to integrate another discussions. But I think that's the way we can integrate the moments. So, but I'd like to thank all the colleagues that was and all the people who were very interested in this discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you so much to Professor Dini, Sarah, and Marcos. I hope you enjoyed it. And you've been great. Lots of work about. So now I think we're giving to Auditório da Pastoral for welcoming session.